everybody. Welcome. We'll just take a minute to settle. So thank you for joining this session today. My name is Leslie Mitchell, and I am your moderator for the session. I work for a major global sustainability NGO, Forum for the Future, and we work to catalyse and accelerate change towards a more sustainable future across a whole range of different issues, from food to energy to buildings here today. So today we're going to be discussing ambition loops. How can government policies and bold private sector leadership create the kind of climate action that's necessary to take this to the next level? We're going to bring together policymakers, standard setters, business representatives, and we'll ask them to give you some concrete and tangible guidance on how different actors can accelerate the multiple benefits across the system. Improving the built environment has a triple purpose: climate mitigation through improved building stock, climate adaptation through more resilient infrastructure, and climate adaptation through better, healthier homes for people and therefore for the planet. So, without further ado, I'm going to invite our first speaker. We'll have 3 lightning talks, quick opportunities to really look at some of the key questions in this area, and then we'll have 2 panels following that. So I'd love to invite our first speaker, Morten Helveg Petersen, MEP, member of the Renew Europe Group and Deputy Chair of the IT-RE Committee. Please come up, Morten. So Morten, UNEP and the Global ABC have just released their 2022 progress report. And the message is quite clear. The sector is really lagging behind. It's not on course to reach net zero and to deliver the Paris Agreement. And in fact, the gap is widening. The report highlights the need for urgent action for policymakers and decision makers to achieve a sustainable and resilient future. So, as a policymaker, to put you on the spot, what do you see as needed?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me today. It's a pleasure being here, and I look forward to engage and discuss with you all. Now, I mean, so many things need to be done, and we're not moving fast enough for sure. But just a couple of reflections. So I serve as Vice President of the European Parliament's Industry and Energy Committee. We have a massive agenda, a legislative agenda called Fit for 55. We would do legislation on renewables, on energy efficiency, and on buildings as well. And I think seen from a European perspective, I mean, what's happening with the war in Ukraine is really a wake-up call for all of us. Now, we tend to focus a lot on the generation side, on renewables. I've been involved myself in a lot of work on offshore renewables, onshore PV as well. But what is new is that given the urgency that we're in Europe in getting rid of imports of fossils from Putin, the entire efficiency discussion is having a renaissance, so to speak, and buildings as well. I mean, given the staggering numbers out there, bear in mind 40% of our energy consumption in Europe is within buildings. It's a third of our greenhouse gas emissions. So in order to fulfill our climate objectives, we simply have to be more progressive and ambitious on buildings as well. And this is coming to the forefront of policymakers much too late, you can argue, and much definitely needs to be done. So we are right now in the midst of negotiating the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And a lot of issues in there that are complicated and tricky politically. It'll be very difficult and tough negotiations when we really get to the heart of the matter. But just to touch upon some of the issues in there, and then I'll conclude or wrap it up in the first phase. So we're talking about building automation control issues. Bear in mind, you have millions of households in Europe today that are not even able to regulate their room temperatures. I mean, we do not necessarily need high sophisticated solutions to this. It could be a matter of installing quite basic and simple thermostats, just to pick on this. Health issues, indoor climate issues are becoming to the forefront as well, because people are increasingly realizing that our indoor climate affects general health issues as well. It's going to be an important topic. We're talking about data management as well. And then perhaps the most controversial and difficult issue in this is the minimum energy performance standards. So we're trying to classify, we have classification systems, but can we renovate faster and moving our building stock up the ladder, so to speak? And this is going to be the big crunch issues, because we'll disagree in Europe a lot whether that is a pan-European issue to solve, or should member states or countries do it on their own. My personal opinion is that it is a pan-European issue. We should push for much stricter standards, and we should renovate faster than what we are doing today. So these are the challenges that we face. I think there's a dawning realization that buildings is key if we are to fulfill our climate objectives. So this is the positive note. The negative note is that we're not moving fast enough.
Thank you, Morten. And I guess the key thing that I see here is this question of ambition and ambition together. And so I would really bring you back to the thought here, the question here, of how can you work together? How can policymakers and those who have power within business create that shift? Thank you, Morten. I'm going to ask Bex to come up now. Perhaps if you two can swap over. Bex Porter is the Built Environment Lead at UNFCCC Climate Champions. And Bex, can you give us a top-line picture of where we and how we can unlock transformative action towards net zero, and what's the current status? Where do we need to go?
Sure. Thanks, Leslie. The brief that I wrote down was a wake-up call for the building sector. So I think actually Morten has shared already a little bit of that, but that wake-up call would be that the building sector is quite simply not on track to meet the 2030 breakthrough outcome. That 2030 breakthrough outcome being that by 2030 all new projects must be net zero carbon in operation, with a halving of embodied emissions. And that is the reality that this conversation today exists in. We have a very time-bound, a very urgent, a very huge challenge, and one that is only compounded by its scale. The attention that national, local policies and regulation gives to the built environment is quite simply not commensurate with the scale of the emissions that the sector is responsible for. So what will shift that? It's moved. So the role of the climate champions is to mobilise and bring the ratcheted ambition of businesses, cities, non-state actors closer to the work of governments. And we think of this demonstration of real economy shift and real economy movement as the opportunity to drive that major ambition loop for policy change, ultimately, and more ambitious policy change. The businesses and cities essentially can de-risk the policy of the national governments. And of course, also part of this, I'll just add, wrong way, is then the civic and market demand that this creates. So we have businesses, investors, cities, these prime movers putting pressure on the political ambition, which in turn builds momentum for the civic market demand, which in turn increases the support for the political ambition. What we actually find in our sector is within that non-state actor bubble, within that business city bubble, we have a series of mini ambition loops, a series of mini supply-demand loops and unique partnerships to accelerate this change. So, for example, we need the demand signals from the private sector. Deutsche Bank, who have over 6,000 buildings across Europe, have committed to World GBC's net zero carbon buildings commitment to only occupy net zero carbon buildings. That's a huge private sector demand signal to the market. We also need the public sector demand signals from cities who not only implement policy but own huge swathes of building stock, from schools to social housing. We need those policy signals, those demand signals, from policy, which is, an example of Chicago in the USA. They're going to supply all of their municipal buildings by 2025 with renewable energy. And to do that, they've created a procurement partnership with a renewable energy supplier. They've given the confidence to that supplier that the market will exist for them. In turn, they can scale up their technology and lower the cost. So it's these partnerships that really provide the markets, be that the heavy industry market, the designers market, and they provide the markets with that certainty that the changes they need to implement will not be value engineered out along the way, which I'm sure a lot of people in this room will be so familiar with. So ultimately, we need everyone. We need everyone to invest in radical collaboration, in unique and iterative partnerships across different stakeholder groups. But I think also we need to demonstrate the action that we do already see in the built environment. And critically, we need to demonstrate the bankability of these projects, the scalability of these projects, the co-benefits of these projects when it comes to clean air, when it comes to green job creation. And we need to demonstrate all of that outside of this room, because we are very good at having these conversations within our sector, or we're certainly getting better. But for me, let's start shouting louder, let's start speaking to the investors, speaking to the policymakers, and help us scale up the solutions that we know we've already got.
Thank you, Bex.
Thanks.
And it's clear that we do actually know what some of these solutions are. It's just a case of getting on and doing it and seeing that systemic approach. I want to take a slightly different tack now. I'd like to introduce Valentino De Marco, if you'd like to come to the stage. Valentino is from the Argentinian Network of Municipalities Against Climate Change, RAMCC. Valentino, cities and citizens are at the front of climate change. What are your expectations of the building sector to deliver net zero buildings of the future? And how can cities and businesses create ambition loops to accelerate that progress?
Okay, so I work in the Argentinian Network of Municipalities Facing Climate Change. We are an organization that gathers over 277 Argentinian municipalities. So now I'm going to try to give you the local perspective on what we are doing on energy efficiency, what are our expectations, and how can we define better public policies to foster this kind of activities. So we are a group of engineers and specialists that provide technical support to the local governments so that they can define their local public policies on mitigation and adaptation to climate change based on calculations of greenhouse gas emissions, on climate risk assessments, etc. So telling you this because we have already elaborated over 160 greenhouse gas emissions of Argentinian municipalities. These are tools that show you all of the activities that are held in the territory and how much greenhouse gases they generate. So we identified that Argentinian municipalities have the most participation in the total of emissions in the energy and transport sector. This is why we really need to define strategies on sustainable transport, on infrastructure, on renewable energies, on energy efficiency, on construction also. This is really important. So our expectations are really high. We really want to continue defining this kind of actions. We are really making a really big effort in training people in actually two main lines, that is reducing energy consumption and sustainable transport. And how can we accelerate this kind of actions? Well, making the greenhouse gas inventories is essential because you first need the political commitment. Without political commitment of the mayors, you can't define effective and realistic public policies. You can't implement climate action. This is why you need to integrate in the annual budget of municipalities this kind of energy efficiency actions in the different sectors. And for this, you need the political commitment. How do we achieve it? We need to show them numbers, evidence. That is why we need to make our greenhouse gas inventories with specialists and show them the participation that the energy sector has in the total emissions of the territory. This way they can know, they can realize the impact that each one of the little actions or big actions that they are going to define is going to have in the total of the emissions. So thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Valentina. And I hope we've seen from 3 different angles here the challenges that we face. Could we just thank our speakers and for giving us a great introduction to this space. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on to 2 panel sessions now, and I'd like to invite all the panelists up here. I'd like to welcome Pauline Oktebeck, Head of Sales Europe at Carbon Trust, Victoria Kate Burrows, Director of Advancing Net Zero with the World Green Buildings Council, Duncan Baker-Brown, Co-Chair of the Climate Advisory Group for REBA, Johanna Pirinen, Senior Vice President, Head of Sustainability for Stora Enso's Wood Products Division, and Jamie Rusby, Group Director for Sustainability for Velux Group. So we're going to address 2 key themes in the next few minutes. First of all, how do we design for a net zero carbon ready future for buildings? And secondly, how can we take responsibility for the net zero carbon ready building stock that we'll create? So first of all, I'm going to look to Victoria and Duncan. And you should have, hey, excellent, a mic. So we've got maybe 10 minutes or so to talk through a couple of questions here. First of all, can we actually design our way to a net zero carbon ready future? What's the role of design? Can we make it happen?
Go on, you go first.
I've got the mic. Yeah, good morning, everybody. For 30 years, I've been a practicing architect, academic, and researcher in the world of sustainable design. And I normally introduce myself by saying you wouldn't have heard of me because of that. And I think we're in really transformative times because now we're in a world where everybody wants to know what I've been thinking about for 30 years, along with everybody else. So my answer to your question is we know what to do. We know how to do it. What's happening is the world is transforming and legislation and politicians need to catch up, and we're playing catch up at the moment. We know what to do as an industry. I represent the RIBA today, the Royal Institute of British Architects. We came up with our 2030 climate challenge. We've got architects buying into that. That's recognising reducing embodied carbon, operational carbon, well-being design, to make places that are inhabitable, as well as potable water. But what we're really interested in is how to occupy buildings. In Europe at the moment, we can't afford to occupy the buildings that we're in. Businesses are going bust because they can't afford their energy bills. We're only able to afford our energy bills at home at the moment because our government's borrowing to pay inflated fossil fuel prices. Meanwhile, renewables are 1/9 the cost of fossil fuels. Yet we're not getting that. I happen to have solar PV on my house at the moment. So what's the good news there is that I used to pay 5p a kilowatt for generating power. I now get paid 15p a kilowatt. So the renewables are there waiting to be accessed. We can't afford the materials to build new buildings at the moment in the UK, in the 5th richest nation in the world. So we're looking at retrofit. It's becoming more of an attractive option. And of course, with our local authorities, 90% of our local authorities in the UK have committed to being net zero by 2030. They're coming to this realization that was mentioned earlier, that the built environment is such a consumer of stuff and a creator of carbon that if you deal with that, you're going to deal with your problem. And it's low-lying fruit, but we need the incentives to accelerate mass retrofit. At the moment in the UK, if you retrofit a home, you pay VAT at 20%. If you demolish and start again, it's 0 rated. These things are about to change. So the thing we need to do is accelerate the training and consider a retrofit of our built environment across Europe and everywhere else that needs it. We need climate resilient buildings across the world. This is a large infrastructure project. It's a huge opportunity for jobs and wealth creation. We just got to do it in a different way. We cannot afford to throw materials at a construction site, have the sort of 20% waste flows that we have at the moment in our construction industry. We just can't afford to do that anymore. Nobody can, not even the richest developers. So these are good transformative times, and legislation, I think, is about to catch up.
Victoria.
I have to say, I wish I was moderating, so I have so many follow-up questions
Yes.
from you. That was amazing. Thank you very much. And Snap on the solar panels as well. I'm really pleased that we made that investment. Thank you, first of all, for covering the issue around existing stock, because it is a massive challenge. And also the piece around incentives. And I wanted to also expand on the skills piece, because if all those frameworks were in place to incentivize the acceleration of building retrofit, we simply don't have the labor force to deliver on that. So that's a kind of dual challenge that we need to be addressing as well. And perhaps I can take a kind of similar approach to new buildings. And yes, some of the financial challenges are affecting the way that we are choosing the materials that we're building with. But some of the best case studies I've heard about for net zero buildings at this COP from Egypt and from Africa have definitely not been high cost and high tech. Like, some of the best solutions for high performance buildings exist in the simplest measures, and bringing it right back to what we were taught at architecture school. But also this concept of getting net zero ready, and I really liked that you used that term, because it's a kind of danger to industry for us to position net zero as the kind of target for all buildings in all locations to get to and aspire to, because in some cases that means expensive solutions. And what we call for the World Green Building Council is to work within what's possible and what's viable within a market, and to make a development net zero ready. Maybe that means not installing solar panels today in a certain market, but preparing the roof structure or the plant space for a future installation, making sure that building is all electric and you're not tapping in, or locking in, I should say, kind of high fossil fuel solutions like gas and diesel. So thinking about the long-term solutions that can be implemented into these projects today, because, as we've heard, it's about scaling up now. We know how to do it. We can't just wait for the legislation to catch up with the innovations of the sector to deliver against these challenges. So it's just a case of flicking that switch and making sure that every building we're designing today is designing with optimum solutions from both performance and materials in mind. And yes, cost will drive that, but a carbon budget on projects should also drive it too.
Great. So can you just come back to me, and between the two of you, give me a sense of, if you were to say the top 3 or 4 recommendations you would make to the building sector of what they need to be focusing their priorities and attention on now, what would they be?
We've got to employ the best designers around the world that understand that different places have different solutions. We need to reacquaint ourselves with vernacular, the way of doing it where you are. There's no international solutions for design anymore. That was a design style that happened 100 years ago. We've got to get over that. So locally specific design solutions are number one. And the other thing which you'll get from that is a dramatic reduction in the consumption of stuff. So we've got to dramatically reduce that, because at the moment the construction sector consumes about 60 to 70 billion tons of stuff every year. And in the UK, we throw away 120 million tons of stuff a year, and that's 60% of the UK's waste flow. In Europe, it's only 35 to 40% of the waste flows from the construction sector. In the UK, it's 60%. So we need to stop throwing stuff away. And then with that comes reduced embodied carbon, and an ability to meet net zero targets.
Yeah, I'd perhaps again expand on that. I think this concept of carbon budgets is really powerful, because you're evaluating every design decision not just on a cost basis, but whether we can afford it from a carbon basis. And if you can't do anything else, report on the carbon impacts of your projects, because that data really helps us understand what the impacts of our sector is, why we're choosing to select certain materials, questioning whether actually there's a better solution, and trying to actually put down in writing why we've chosen this carbon intensive option over another, accountability for the designs that we're creating today, despite what regulation might allow us to build, because that's part of the challenge. There can be some huge gaps. Again, some of the great circular economy examples and case studies we've heard about today, this week at COP27, are because of a virtue of necessity. So if it's possible in Africa, it's possible in the rest of the world.
One of the key themes that we've seen through this, and the theme of this particular session here, is around working together and being more systemic in approaches. How are architects, developers and urban designers working together and with other actors across the system to create that net zero carbon ready space?
Yeah, what's been really exciting, actually, since COVID, there have been a number of cross-sector initiatives. For example, I'm talking about the UK, so I'm from the UK, so apologies for that. But yeah, for example, we've got the London Energy Transformation Initiative. LETI came up with the Climate Emergency Design Guide that had the buy-in from across sector. I'd never seen so many organisations, in the construction sector, clients, end users, everybody, basically committing to a net zero carbon descent plan. So we're in a situation where we're all talking to each other now, which is excellent. And I sit on the governance board for the net zero construction standard, which is going to be like a rule book for the industry that we'll go back to our ministers and to BEIS, our ministry dealing with it, and say this is what we need building regulations to do. And we're poised, we're a year away from that, or 9 months away from that. So these are really exciting times because we're talking to each other, and there is a consensus now. We've got the Federal sort of Corporation of London, the Financial District of London, asking what's the best way to achieve net zero? Please tell us. And understanding the concept of embodied carbon, which means once they're recognizing that and valuing that, they'll prioritize retrofit and reuse over demolition.
So maybe then from a global perspective, World Green Building Council has green building councils in I think we're now 77 national green building councils around the world, and they all work together too, bringing in the feedback from their members on some of the toolkits and the frameworks that we publish to help explain, again, this is how you deliver net zero. And I think it's to the point that Bex made earlier, the private sector needs to be loud and proud about how we're delivering on these solutions and what the answers are, because that creates the confidence from policymakers to say, okay, maybe we can set a long-term roadmap, which then helps create more investment in the net zero solutions or towards a net zero economy, and then we have more and more policies coming in. It kind of creates that confidence that, we can do it, we know what it is, and more importantly, we can deliver on those policies. So it's really important that these frameworks across disciplines, but also across the various disciplines in the stakeholder supply chain, which is equally as important, and then also across the different countries in different regions, because otherwise we'd be recreating that process in every country around the world, and we can learn a lot from each other, and that's why networks like World Green Building Council exist.
Great, thank you. I guess if you were talking to somebody who was either a policymaker who was unconvinced or a laggard in the industry, what would you be saying to them in terms of why they should be getting behind this? Because I'm standing here, I don't work in the buildings world, I work on food and agriculture, and I'm standing here and wondering, well, why hasn't this all happened yet?
Yeah,
so what do you need to tell them?
Well, actually, I asked them why not, because we learn as much or if not more from why they're choosing not to take that step, from why they're choosing not to take it, than them sort of me asking what do you need from us, because finding out about what's missing from them and those gaps, maybe it's in the confidence, maybe it's understanding the numbers or the financials, we can then go back to our networks and say, we're hearing this really loudly, that we won't move the needle unless we deliver this, let's do it. And then so for me, it's we really need to understand what those holdups are, because we know that it's not a technical problem or a technical challenge. We know the solutions exist. We know increasingly it's not a financial one, because the numbers are showing that actually you can deliver net zero buildings at net zero cost in a lot of markets and a lot of building types. So now I think it's purely perceptual.
Did you have some last thoughts?
Well, just one last thought is I've been trying to it sounds like a plug, but I've been trying to publish a book called The Reuse Atlas with the RIBA, and it's a year delayed because there are so many good case studies out there. So it's around reuse in the circular economy in the construction sector, and there's a load of case studies out there, large-scale ones. People are doing it. I think it's, at the moment, it's a way of achieving net zero targets and saving money. It's the cost-effective solution. Fossil fuels have priced themselves out of the market.
There's so much energy coming from the two of you, and it just really strikes me. You're sitting in front of something that's talking about the operational CO2 emissions reaching an all-time high. So I hope that the sector hears this conversation, hears what you're saying today, and really gets behind this. So thank you hugely for your time here. Let me just turn now to Pauline, Johanna and Jamie. I don't know if you guys want to sit together so you can pass the mic. Just a little shuffle around. We promise we won't do musical chairs and take the seats away. Great. So, Pauline, Johanna and Jamie, what are the most important targets that people should be heading towards, and what are the most important actions needed across the buildings value chain to deliver net zero carbon ready building stock?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the kind of bigger picture, and then with the companies can talk about their own targets. So from the Carbon Trust perspective, science-based targets have more or less become codified best practice in terms of corporate target setting across sectors, and the building sector is no exception. So what we're looking at is 1.5 degree aligned targets near term, so looking up to 2030, but importantly also that net zero level of ambition as well, whether that's 2040 and 2050. And I think the really important thing to note here as well for the building sector, and indeed all other sectors, is that it's looking at scopes 1, 2 and 3. So the buildings operations emissions are obviously massive, and those still need to continue to reduce, but I do think that in the past years the focus really has been there, and great strides have been made. More progress can be made, as has already been shared, but it's the embodied emissions as well that really need to be tackled. So that's typically the scope 3 emissions of a construction company, a property developer, etc. So it's really looking at what carbon are you locking into the building, because once the building is built, it's done, right? That carbon has been used, and construction materials are often very carbon intensive. So the targets that need to be set are then making sure that not only in the construction you're looking at the lowest carbon materials, so the embodied carbon reduces, but of course that's done at the planning stage. You can't change it once it's built. And then the operating emissions should be in line with net zero as well. And I think the important thing from a reporting perspective is not just what are the targets we are setting, it's also what is then the implementation plan for that. So I think what was really interesting from the previous discussion is that thing about signals, showing that the demand is there. So if a property developer signals, we are going to align to net zero, and they kind of line out very clearly, these are our preferred materials. This is, how these are the switches we're going to make. This is how we are actually going to achieve net zero as it relates to our embodied emissions. That then signals to those the construction material suppliers, oh, there is a shift in demand happening. I will ramp up my own investment in greening my production emissions or my investment in R&D so that I can meet that demand. So it's not just a question of setting targets, it's actually really being transparent on how those targets are being achieved to then kind of signal that demand. So I think maybe then interesting to hear from our corporate examples of responding to that demand.
Thank you. And I would love you to also perhaps reflect on where you're seeing barriers to change and where there might be opportunities that are untapped at this point in time.
Thank you, and very happy to hear the kind of raising the importance of embodied emissions and the idea of carbon budget. So I'm kind of keen on that because it kind of solves the design part of things. So I'm representing Stora, and so we are a provider of nature-based building materials, so really mass timber solutions, building solutions for the market. So solving the issue for the embodied emissions, providing solution there. And wanting to kind of also flag a little bit, construction materials, roughly 10% of global emissions. So that gives you the perspective why the embodied part is important. That's like everyone is making big fuss of aviation, and that's 5 times the emissions from construction materials. So yes, retrofits, not wasting any of the material, I think that's super. And expansions, because also like, well, wood provides good opportunities for expansions. But then really looking at it, and that brings it actually back to the EU Green Deal that was mentioned earlier. So construction product regulation is quite key, and there I think if there is still time to make wishes as science-based, because like you say, science-based really needs to be there. So not too simple, because in construction products it's not a consumer market as such, it really is a business market, and then life cycle analysis, environmental product declarations are actually giving the science-based that would then allow the carbon budget-based design, which cannot really be done based on the traffic lights alone. So there was a little bit of perspective, and I think these are the same kind of barriers that you can see. I've been so happy to see that the discussion to whole life emissions and embodied carbon has kind of reached it. I've seen a lot of designers and engineering companies now react that they are actually bringing this knowledge of carbon budget and their solutions into the design. So hopefully we are onto something, because it's a wide value chain. We need to get every part of the value chain moving together towards this enormous challenge. And it is being quite depressing, the late reports and everything, that we need to move and we need to do this much faster.
Certainly a wake-up call. Jamie. Yeah.
Hello everyone, good to be here. I'm from Velux Group, and we are a manufacturer of roof windows for residential and commercial buildings. And I think Beck's outlined on the targets question, I think Beck's outlined it very well. Net zero buildings and operations for new builds by 2030 and halving embodied emissions. And there's a reason we have those targets. It's because it's what the science demands. And in Velux, we're also committed to the 1.5 degree pathway. So that means 100% reduction in our operational emissions and a 50% reduction in our value chain emissions. So that's the embodied carbon. We make windows that go into buildings, so it's the materials that go into our products that go into buildings. So we're busy working on the decarbonisation of those materials. And I think when we talk about what's the business case for doing that, I think of course we all depend on a stable climate to operate and thrive. But at the same time, I think it's this conversation around carbon budgets and carbon requirements for buildings on a life cycle basis that really creates the demand right the way through the system. So I think that when we're seeing front runners like Denmark moving on this, and I think if we are able to make advancement on that, then we can say actually for companies to be relevant for these type of net zero buildings, they need to come with low carbon products and materials. Simple as that. So there's a strong business case for that.
And what will it take to bring other businesses on board? Again, that question around laggards and so on. What are the incentives? Is it carrot? Is it stick? What do you see as enabling this to become mainstream?
Yeah, well, I think companies can have a huge impact through their supply chains, I would say. And I just came from a meeting with our top 200 suppliers last week, and we had a discussion. I think the challenge is some are on the level. When we started this journey, 80 out of 130 were not reporting their emissions. So what we've done is we've worked with them. We've said why this is important to us, what we're asking from them, and also working with them, with Carbon Trust and others, to start estimating and reporting emissions. So that's creating the data, and I think that's a big challenge. Then I think there are some companies who are further ahead in their decarbonisation journey, and we've working with a couple of key aluminium suppliers to actually set joint decarbonisation targets to get down to 1/5 of the emissions per kilo of aluminium, for example, by 2030, and that's a joint target. And we were asked in that supplier meeting, what did you do, Velux, to persuade these companies to set this target? And then I was about to answer the question, but then of course the supplier stood up and said, there was no persuasion needed. We are looking for this demand from customers, and we are ready to go on this journey together. And what we don't want is companies saying, how can I use this for my marketing purposes? We need companies who are committed to do this together. So I think if we can bring together this supply and demand side and create that positive loop, then I think we're really onto something.
Do you have further thoughts?
No, I was absolutely right, and I'm happy to hear that we are not the only one who are pushing suppliers and actually partnering up, because I think that word that has been a lot here is the value chain partnering. And before we get this mainstream, it's also kind of getting this kind of small groups together, but it is sometimes frustrating because you kind of do it one by one then. But we had an example this year of joining forces with CompuNPU, NCC and Rumble to kind of compare some of the projects that have been designed for concrete originally, and what would it be then when you do it in mass timber. And then it's more trustworthy when we did it together, because I know the data, but if I shout alone, it's not really there. So it was a good exercise to have the value chain looking at the issue together. But now, as you say, I wish I would have the magic wand to kind of amplify it and multiply it. But there we discovered that on the structural, building structural level, we could cut 70% of the emissions when changing the design in the mass timber solution. And if you are interested on that, it's lowcarbonbuilding.fi where you can find it, so that it's not our data alone, it's actually then Rumble and NCC data on it.
That was going to be one of my questions here, was if you were stepping into this space and really trying to understand it, are there particular beacons or places where people can go to find out how to navigate around this space and where the action is and where the ambition is actually turning into action?
So I think I want to build on what you just said, which starts to maybe answer your question, is the need for open source data. Because I think, on the one hand, you need to be able to compare different solutions so that you can make an informed choice on carbon, and you need to be able to see the full life cycle assessment of a given material in order to make that choice. But perhaps not everyone's calculating things to the same standard. Perhaps the supplier doesn't have a supplier-specific LCA, so you might be looking at a global LCA that says, on average, material X has emissions Y, but that doesn't take the national context into consideration or that specific company context. So you really need to level the playing field with open source data that is then comparable between these materials so that you can make informed decisions. So I really welcome, the publishing of that. I think that's a really great step forward. And by making this open source, you just make everything easier, better, and cheaper for everyone, rather than keeping, those studies close to your chest. And as a supplier, doing LCAs of your products is only going to unlock lots of opportunities for yourself. So yeah, I think that's a really, really important step forward.
Thank you. I can see Duncan and Victoria busting to get in on the conversation here. And I would ask you just to reflect as you move on from here. You're all very progressive. You're all sitting here at the start. What is the one thing you could do from your position to really accelerate this shift and to build out that joint shared ambition? So let's go to Duncan. Do you want to go?
Okay, so it refers to data. It's something that's big in the RIBA at the moment. It's this idea of post-occupancy evaluation. I went into a very well-known sustainable building 2 weeks ago, and its EPC rating was E, proudly displayed on the front door. I will not say where it is. We need to understand what works and what doesn't. There's a lot of people having a good go, but if it doesn't work and it's got a high profile, loads of people are going to copy it. So post-occupancy evaluation, the recording of that, the open sourcing of that data, so we can all learn from good practice.
So I just wanted to share about the idea of buyers clubs, because it's fantastic that organizations like this are partnering with different solutions providers and supply chains to try and figure out what solutions exist out there or what's needed. But what we need is volume of demand, and the manufacturers are waiting for that demand of heavy industry, are waiting for that demand to come from policy, and as we heard, that won't come without demand from the private sector. And so there's initiatives like Steel Zero and Concrete Zero that, if you're not sure where to start, is a really good place to start, because it creates the kind of aggregation of people who are specifying or buying those sorts of materials to then say to the steel producers and the concrete producers that if you don't change the way you produce these materials, you won't be able to sell them. And initiatives like Buy Clean Acts from the states of California and Washington State are showing that from a public procurement perspective as well. So there's always something you can do no matter where you are in that journey, and start with joining a buyers club just to put your statement out there, and then eventually it'll help us move that wheel as well and tighten that ambition loop that Bex was talking about earlier.
Hugely inspiring. I just wonder if we have a couple of questions from the floor. We literally only have 2 or 3 minutes for them. So do we need a microphone for people?
Here we go. I can
You're doing it DIY here.
James Drinkwater from Ladders Foundation. A question given it's Biodiversity Day. Is the built environment thinking about the role of nature the right way? We talk about getting to zero carbon. We were talking about just a bit more energy efficiency a few years ago, so it's great the trajectory's changed. But if the IPCC report says we have to do massive carbon removal alongside industry getting to net zero, is our industry investing enough in nature's role?
I've got the mic. Sorry. Shouldn't give me the mic. No, in short, we're not. I mean, in the UK, we've got this thing called biodiversity net gain. So, you rock up at a site and you've then develop it, you've got to prove that you're plus 10%. But what I'm really interested in, I've constructed buildings made out of locally sourced timber. The management of that timber actually increases the level of biodiversity in these managed woodlands. So that's what I'm really interested in, raising awareness of the potential of organic materials to increase levels of biodiversity. We can work in harmony with the natural world, and that needs to be a message, and we're not doing enough. But a number of us know what to do, including the person about to pass the mic over to.
But that was a great introduction, so Stura, and so I'm so happy about the question, because we have really looked at everything science-based through the planetary boundaries concept lens. And our kind of key areas that we work on our transformation are climate, biodiversity, and then circularity. So all the words that are actually needed here. And just this morning, I think it's now out, so I dare to say this, forest sector nature positive roadmap has been just published. So we hear you, nature needs to be considered, and it is really aiming to be biodiversity positive, and it is with the use of the renewable material that we can really drive it in a good way. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Eloisa Schmidt with Bechtel. We mostly work on very large infrastructure projects, so motorways, airports, etc. Although we do have buildings as part of our oil and gas facilities, mining and metals facilities, etc. One of the big barriers that we see around construction materials in particular is the fact that the specifications of the materials often don't meet the codes and standards requirements, or are not included, specific for alternative cementitious materials that go into concrete. Just wondering from this group, and maybe it's an observation and something that we're tackling as an industry, if there is any, I guess from this group, if there's any effort made to kind of integrate with some of those committees, some of the standards that are often quoted in the industry sector in particular, to make it easier to actually include some of these lower carbon materials as part of construction, specifically around heavier industry, but also if you're thinking about structures like airports and others, you're often dealing with wind velocities, or in the nuclear world, safety of the structures that you're building as well, that imply that you have to have a certain strength of materials and pass through some other hurdles, if you will, to employ those materials. So long-winded question, maybe comment. I'm not sure if anybody has a perspective.
I'm going to have a go. My point of view, in a way, I'm at heart quite a radical around this. But in my point of view, we need to be specifying the correct material for the job. What's happened for me with concrete is it's ubiquitous. It's where, it's replacing earth. Where we could use earth construction, we got concrete. So where we could use timber construction, we got concrete. Where we can, the Shard in London, a massive tower, had a concrete core, but it was then had a steel frame. It's a tall building. That was a number of years ago, 2013. In London, the tall buildings aren't built like that now. They're built almost solid concrete. What's going on? So we overuse some high carbon materials that are very effective. The same with plastic. Plastic is an incredible material. We just don't understand how to deal with it at its end of life. But I think if we use specific materials that do the best job in the specific situations, if you've got large infrastructure, it might be high carbon concrete. That might be the best way forward, but it does not need to be used everywhere all the time. So it's the right material at the right time.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the conversation, the questions there, because we need to really get round to a call to action. So, you're all going away back from COP this weekend, and I would ask you to give us one thing that you think either you or someone else within the sector, from what you've seen while you've been here, what is the one thing that needs to happen, concrete, tangible thing that needs to happen when you get back? You've got like 30 seconds, 45 seconds each.
I'll start maybe. So I think from a target setting perspective, targets are great, but implementation plans are greater. We need action, we need to see what that action is, and the transparency on those plans is what's going to drive the sector forward.
I'm going to keep on communicating and communicating. Maybe that's a simple answer. And then really continue doing the life cycle analysis and publish those environmental product declarations, because we have them. And also when we are sticking to our science-based target and improving our operations further, even they are already good, then we can update the EPDs and have even better results there. So that's what we're going to do.
I think unfortunately we still need to keep the focus on the 2030 targets and clarify what that means. Then I think we will continue to say why we're aligned with that, and also to show through implementation and action actually what can be achieved.
Yeah, well, seeing as this is the implementation COP, I would say that we need as many companies to sign up to the net zero carbon buildings commitment that Bex mentioned as part of the Breakthrough 2030 agenda, because in order to have any chance of achieving the mainstream targets for 2030 and the mainstream targets for 2050, we need to understand what new business models, tools, knowledge and solutions that we need from all the different stakeholders across the value chain. And the commitment signatories are front runners in industry who are choosing to achieve the 2050 targets by 2030. And we're learning a huge amount from what they are doing, and we're using their insights to call for the sorts of policies and actions that we need from others. So join the commitment if you haven't already. Come and talk to me.
Okay. The Global North has had 100 years of creating the Anthropocene. We've produced a lot of stuff. We've done a lot of mining and made stuff out of that. So from the Global North's point of view, we've got to adapt the Anthropocene. Think of the existing built environment as infrastructure that needs adapting, not demolishing and throwing away. So if you have that approach, we'll dramatically reduce our carbon footprint in the Global North and let the Global South develop in a nature-sensitive way.
Thank you. Can you just run the mic over to Bex and Valentina? Just wonder if you have, sorry to put you on the spot, but you didn't really get a chance to share your one big thing. So if you were to take away, either yourself or others, one big thing that needs to happen as you leave COP27 and get back to your day job, what would it be?
I think James put it well when he talked about 2030. I think we really need to get away from this idea that the sector can wait to be net zero by 2050. We have an extremely narrow challenge ahead of us, particularly in the global south, where city growth is just unstoppable and people need housing. We need to build resilient homes without locking in emissions today that are going to cause huge challenges for those parts of the world in the future. Challenges that parts of global north are having to deal with now with our leaky building stock. So yeah, urgency is my call to action.
Thank you.
Okay, and following on what Betsy says, city urbanization is going to still growing. Cities concentrate over 60% of world energy consumption. So it is extremely crucial to achieve that political commitment, to have that local policies, and also to reach other levels of support with incentives and different kind of policies. So I'm going to try fostering, try to promote the elaboration of greenhouse gas inventories with our team in more Argentinian municipalities, so that we can show them the impact of this sector.
Thank you. It's a really rich and inspiring discussion. I'd just like to ask Morten to come back up, perhaps come and join us here, and share your final thoughts, reflections on the session, but also what are you going to take back to your day job in Brussels from what you've heard today?
Well, first of all, thanks for a great discussion. I noted so much stuff down, and it's been extremely inspirational. I'd say this life cycle discussion, life cycle approach is just so bloody important, and adding to what was said on construction issues. I mean, we also have to consider the construction phase and electrifying of the actual construction phase on building sites, but that's just an addition to what was said. I think hopefully we'll see a lot of stuff happening given the price signals in markets now. I mean, you see rates of return of an investment that are very high, obviously, given the spike in energy prices and bills. So stuff is happening, but I think it's extremely important, and this is what I'll bring back to Brussels for my part, that we still have to push in political terms. A lot of good stuff has been said on circularity, on eco-labeling, and the stuff that we're doing from a legislator's point of view. We need to push there, and for my part personally, finalizing the energy performance on buildings directive in the EU is just so urgent, and we need to do it, and incorporating these life cycle approaches, eco-labeling perspectives is what I'll bring back, because I also get obviously the clear impression that industry is ready. I mean, industry is ready, and we see so many great cases and examples of extremely great projects that are really bringing us closer to delivering on our climate commitments, and for sure we have to build on this. Industry is ready, now we need to push politically.
Exactly. I hear one thing, which is that you do have all the tools. You need alignment, you need proximity of those targets to enable ambition to reach reality. You need that systemic connection to join together, and you need policymakers and business working towards one key goal, towards net zero ready buildings. Thank you to everyone for this session. Thank you to Velux for hosting as well. Thank you to Global ABC for the terrifying information that prompts the discussion. But I really look forward, as someone who doesn't work in the building sector, as you can probably tell from my moderation, someone who I work in food and agriculture, I want to come back to COP28 and see what progress has been made. So thank you to all of our panelists, all of our speakers, and thank you to our host today.